How do we practice pigeon pose correctly? Well, this is a really good question, and it's one that I know confuses many yoga practitioners. I tend to get questions about pigeon pose all the time. And I recently got a great question from someone who said that she had asked multiple different yoga teachers how to practice pigeon correctly. And she received multiple different answers. She said that one yoga teacher told her that in order to practice pigeon correctly, we needed to bring this front shin parallel with the front edge of the mat. But then another teacher told her that what actually mattered for pigeon was that your hips were square to the front of your mat. So, like, not turned out to the side. So, that was, according to that teacher, that's what mattered for a correct pigeon pose. And then another teacher said that what mattered to practice pigeon pose correctly was that your hips were down on the floor, like grounded on the floor, that they weren't like up here and floating. And that's what mattered in order to practice pigeon pose correctly. So that's three different answers to one question. And I know there are even more out there, more answers. And so no wonder this is a confusing pose, right? No wonder so many people are confused by it. But today in this video, I wanted to just take a look at pigeon through the lens of anatomy, biomechanics, movement science, like through that perspective. And let's use insights from those fields in order to inform us on how to practice pigeon pose correctly. So the first and the most important thing that I'd like to offer about pigeon pose is that in order to practice pigeon correctly, what really matters is not so much all these little fine-tuned details of where, like what angle the shin is at and where the hips are facing. It's not so much all those little alignment details. But what really matters for pigeon pose is that the individual practicing the pose finds the intended stretch that we're looking for in pigeon pose. And again, we're talking like we're looking at pigeon biomechanically here. And in terms of biomechanics, there's a particular stretch that is kind of the point of the shape. So the stretch that we're looking for is generally to the pigeon leg hip. And in this video, we are focusing mostly on what many people call single leg pigeon. So like this variation of pigeon, as opposed to the many other variations like double pigeon, recline pigeon. We're just thinking single leg pigeon for today. But the main point of pigeon pose is to find a stretch in the posterior hip, so the back side of the hip of the pigeon leg hip. And I know I just said we weren't really going to talk about the other pigeon variations, but in general, with any pigeon variation, that is the main focus, is to find the stretch on the back side of the pigeon leg hip. But we just do that in different orientations depending on the variation. Today, our focused variation will be single leg pigeon. Now, when you're thinking about the pigeon pose leg, let's just think anatomical directions of motion for a moment. This hip, say this is my pigeon leg hip. This hip is in a combination of hip flexion. So that hip flexion is when the thigh moves up like toward your chest. That's flexion. So it's hip flexion. It's hip abduction, hip abduction. So that's when your thigh angles out away from midline. So we have hip flexion, we have hip abduction, and then we also have hip external rotation. So if I kind of show you here, like here would be a neutral hip rotation for this hip, but if I start to swing the shin toward me, that's going to rotate this whole hip into external rotation. So that's what we have in pigeon pose. Hip flexion, hip abduction, like to a certain degree, the abduction out toward the side, and then hip external rotation. It's a combination of those three directions of movement. And then all together combined, that helps us find a stretch in the posterior hip. So again, that's what comes first, is like that we're finding the stretch. It doesn't matter so much what the pose looks like from the outside in terms of all those little details. So when you're thinking about single leg pigeon, as is our focus here, one interesting thing to note is that You can actually practice pigeon pose with an upright torso, which is kind of how I've been demoing it so far in this video, like this. But what we tend to see in most classes is like we come into pigeon and then we fold forward. So when I fold forward, what this does is it actually brings, so my torso angles forward, my pelvis tips forward, and I actually bring my pigeon leg hip into more hip flexion. So that is going to increase the amount of stretch that I feel on the pigeon leg hip. So an upright torso, you might feel something in the pigeon leg hip, but if you start to fold forward, it will turn up, or it should turn up the stretch because you've come into more hip flexion. And then we know there are also variations of pigeon where you might stay upright, where you might even reach up into a back bend and like maybe grab the back foot. So these more upright and more back bendy variations of pigeon, you still will have maybe like some hip mobilization going on in the front hip, but you're also much more going to be maybe thinking more about like this back hip and really the spine. But you've got more of a stretch to the hip flexors across the front of this back leg hip when you start to come more toward the back bend. But the more common practice of pigeon is like to come forward, and then it's more about this front hip. So that's kind of like an overview, anatomical directions of motion and what's going on and what we're looking for there. So let's just take a look at, we'll look at 3 different elements of pigeon, and really those 3 that I mentioned in the very beginning. Let's start by looking at the angle of the shin. It's super common in the yoga world to hear that in order to practice pigeon correctly, we should bring the shin to be parallel with the front edge of the mat. Like this is supposedly correct. And something like this, where the shin is pulled back, would be incorrect in like that way of thinking about pigeon pose. And one thing that I think is interesting about this is that in the yoga world, many people consider Light on Yoga, the book by BKS Iyengar, to be, it's often called like the Bible of modern yoga. It's assigned in tons of yoga teacher training programs, and it's considered an authoritative source for alignment of yoga asana. But if you actually look in Light on Yoga and look at BKS Iyengar practicing pigeon pose, like demonstrating it, this is what his front leg looks like. It's pulled back, maybe even a little more. It's more like that. He does like the upright version, but he does not demonstrate it with the shin forward like this and like perpendicular to the front edge of the mat. That's not how Iyengar shows it in Light on Yoga. So I just think it's interesting that we tend to have this aesthetic ideal in the yoga world today that we must bring the shin to parallel. But what I think is really motivating like that idea is just these ideas, again, of aesthetics and geometry that we like to see with our eyes. We tend to like to see straight lines and right angles, and we like to try to fit our bodies in yoga practice into these like straight line geometrical shapes. And therefore it's natural to maybe think that the front shin should be parallel with the front edge of the mat. That's two straight lines. But, straight lines and right angles, that's not really how the human body works. We don't have any straight angles or straight lines or right angles in the human body. So that's not so much what we're really looking for when we're thinking about pigeon biomechanically. So I'll definitely just throw out there that we do not need to embody this front shin parallel. We don't need to embody this in order to be practicing a correct pigeon. Where we want this shin to be is just where you, the individual, needs to place it in order to find the stretch that we're looking for in the pigeon leg hip. So it might look different for different people. What the human body is variable, and especially like the hip joints and the way that the two bones articulate there, the directions that our hip sockets face, all of that can be variable between individuals. So we don't really want to layer on this like arbitrary objective ideal that all bodies need to bring the front shin parallel to find your correct pigeon. But what we should think about, what we might want to know about anatomically with pigeon and this front shin alignment is that when you're in pigeon, the further forward the shin comes, like up to the point of, pretty much perpendicular, That's going to rotate this thigh into more external rotation. So you can just think the closer to parallel the front shin is, the more I'm externally rotating the pigeon-like hip. And then the more that the shin angles back, I'm coming out of external rotation. So this thigh is starting to turn more, more downward. And then you could think about it. It kind of helps visually to think about, well, what if I brought the foot all the way back? Now the shin is straight back. And now I'm in 0 degrees of hip rotation. This is just a lot of hip flexion, but no rotation. So if you start here from 0, you can see that as the shin scoots forward, it just naturally will turn this thigh out. So like kind of all the way up to parallel. So that's what the shin angle is about. It's just the more forward it is, the more external rotation you'll come into. But once again, our hip joints are not the same they don't all look the same in all bodies. So in order for each person to find their individual perfect stretch, this front shin, there are a myriad of different specific places it could be placed. And the correct place for that one person is just where it needs to be placed in order for you to find your stretch. So that's what's going on with the front shin. Let's talk about the squared hip situation. So this is one that we tend to hear. And again, if you think about squared hips, it's these similar kind of geometric ideals where squares, right angles, straight lines, we like to apply this to the body, but the human body doesn't really work like that. So this idea that in order to practice pigeon pose correctly, the hips must be square. This is also something that we should question. So this is what squared hips look like. And then the idea is that if we were to unsquare, and generally when we unsquare, I'll demo it this way. So here's quote squared hips. If I were to unsquare, generally we see it kind of like this, where I've kind of laid onto the pigeon-like hip and my non-pigeon-like hip is kind of rolled on top. Now I'm kind of exaggerating it just to show you what I mean, but see how this is not square. This is more facing to the side, whereas this is square. And we do tend to see in a lot of yoga classes, we'll see yoga practitioners come into pigeon and they kind of lean on the pigeon-like hip and fold forward like this, where this other hip is kind of rolled up. So some yoga teachers, many yoga teachers would say that this is incorrect. This is not correct pigeon pose. But I'll just come back to that first principle that I laid out in the beginning, which was for you to find your correct pigeon, you just need to find the alignment in your body that brings you the stretch that you want to find in your posterior hip. So all that the deal is with these squared hips is yoga rules would like us to believe that there's only one correct alignment, and that is squared hips. So here, this is 100% correct. And if I start to turn to the side, that's 100% incorrect. I'm doing a wrong pigeon if my hips turn out. But that's not really the case biomechanically. Instead, we should just think about where the hips are really the pelvis more accurately. Where the pelvis faces, we could think about it on a spectrum within this direction of movement. So the more that the pelvis faces the side, the less we are going to find and feel that stretch in the pigeon-like hip. We've kind of come out of the stretch. And these posterior hip tissues are kind of a little more shortened when I'm not squared. But if you can sort of see, you kind of picture these tissues, as I start to turn this, the left hip forward, and as I come more toward square, I'm starting to lengthen and pull on these posterior tissues more. So the more that we square, the more we are putting a stretch on the posterior hip tissue. So it's just, where do you need to be along this spectrum in order to find the stretch that you want to be feeling? For some people, fully squared is just too intense. It's too much. For some people, having the shin perpendicular, to go back to the first example, is too much, and they need to pull it back. So where do you need to be? And you could you could definitely find experiment with an interplay between these two variables. Where's your front shin and where are your hips facing? Because for many people, if they go for that front shin parallel situation, then that's going to be a lot of external rotation. And maybe they're at their max stretch, or maybe it's even too much for them. So their body may naturally self-organize by kind of reducing the stretch somewhere else by turning the hips to the side, because this may just be a little much to have, parallel front shin and squared hips. That may be too much. So instead, maybe we turn the hips to the side, and that's like the interplay that just works out for that person. So hopefully that makes sense. With both of those questions, there is no like you click in and now it's correct, and then you're not there and it's incorrect. It's not like that. It's just about where do they need to be within this, larger box of Pigeon. We are in a general form, a general shape that we're all in together of single leg Pigeon. But as far as like these smaller alignment details, where the shin is, where the hips face, those are going to be variable depending on your body. So those were two variables. Let's talk about the third one quickly. And that was the question of the hips as a whole and like where they are in space. Because we know that sometimes we hear that in order to practice Pigeon correctly, the hips should be down on the floor. They should not be up off the floor. So what's up with that? Well, if we go back to our anatomical directions of motion, we talked about pigeon leg being hip flexion, abduction, and external rotation. So the hips up or hips down, where that comes in is in terms of hip flexion. That's the main direction of movement that's being manipulated there. So now I'm kind of on my back, like you could pretend that I'm flipped over. But like say here I am in Pigeon, the closer that my leg comes to me, the closer it comes, the more hip flexion I come into and the more stretch that I should feel through the posterior hip. So more hip flexion is more stretch, less hip flexion, the leg further away from me, is less stretch. That's a way to back off the hip stretch. So if we flip that over and we look at our, more the way that we see Pigeon pose practice in single leg Pigeon, then it's similar here. So when my hips are up, this Pigeon leg is further away from me. I'm in less hip flexion. Then if my hips come down, my pelvis descends, I've come into more hip flexion. The Pigeon leg is now closer to me. So more hip flexion with the hips down, less hip flexion with the hips up. So once again, when we're thinking biomechanically, there's not one like correct position here. All the way down is not correct, and up floating is not incorrect. Again, it's just a spectrum. Like, how do you want to manipulate this variable in order to find the stretch that you want to find? So if you stay up, that's going to turn down the stretch a bit. And if you come all the way down, that will increase the stretch. So where does your body want to be in order to find the level of stretch for you? For many people, doing all three of these things, like in the kind of old school yoga rule way, which would be shin parallel, hips totally square forward, and hips down on the floor. So that would be all three of those in one. If you were to, for most people, if we combine all of those, that's probably going to be like very intense and maybe too much. Like maybe that just doesn't work for someone's body. So a easy way to kind of back out would just be to lift your hips a little higher and not insist on them being all the way down. And then that would be like backing out of hip flexion, but then maybe you keep the front shin parallel, maybe you keep your hips squared, but that third variable you've backed out of. If your hips are going to be up off the floor, that's great. It's totally fine. It's fine to practice Pigeon with your hips up. But a lot of people prefer to add a little bit of padding, some sort of support. Like I've got a yoga block here, but you could use a yoga bolster or a folded blanket, just something to place underneath that otherwise floating hip so that it can kind of have that sensation of grounding down. So here you've kind of propped up and supported your pose, and then you can come forward. So that's just a great way to meet your body where it wants to be met in terms of keeping the pelvis up if you decide to choose that. So once again, it's no wonder the Pigeon pose is kind of an inherently confusing yoga asana. There's a lot going on. We focused on three elements of the pose today: the angle of the front shin, whether the hips are squared or turn out to the side, and then where like the pelvis or the hips, where they are vertically, if they're up or if they're down. And we can, in anyone's own individual body, you can manipulate all three of those variables, like turn one up, turn one down, until you find the perfect stretch for your body. So hopefully, as you can see, that's what comes first, is that we find the stretch that we want. And what doesn't matter is like all those little fine-tuned details of those aesthetic ideals. We don't need to worry about straight lines, right angles, and squares when it comes to the human body. It can be helpful to have those concepts in terms of thinking about and like even directing movement. I like those types of terms just to help with like directing in a general way how students might align their bodies. But we don't need to get super fine-tuned, detailed, nitpicky, micromanaging on these levels, because it's not the aesthetics that come first in yoga asana. It's how we're feeling in our body, and are we finding the intended effect of the pose. So hopefully that helps clarify somewhat about this otherwise potentially confusing yoga pose. And if you appreciated this content, subscribe to my channel so you can stay up to date on all of the content that I share.